This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system that quietly rewrote the rules while you were busy living inside it. A system where internal violence is no longer contained, where domestic repression is no longer domestic, where the line between protest and war has thinned to a sentence spoken once and meant literally, you are used to thinking that wars start at borders, that they begin with missiles, with votes, with declarations. That assumption is now wrong. What's happening here is smaller than a war headline and far more dangerous, because for the first time in a long time, the trigger for international force is no longer geography. It's behavior. And once a system decides that, it cannot unlearn it. Stay with me, because the mechanism that makes this possible is already running. And once you see it, you can't unsee what comes next. What actually controls this system now is not ideology, not diplomacy, not even weapons. It's conditional credibility. Power used to be exercised after events. Now it's exercised in anticipation of them. The controlling mechanism here is a promise made out loud, a promise that ties external force to internal behavior, not to borders, not to treaties, but to how a government treats its own people in real time. That's the shift. Once a leader says, if you do this, we will respond, and removes ambiguity about whether they mean it, the system locks in. Every actor is forced to calculate against that sentence. Security forces, judges, protesters, foreign governments, markets. The system stops asking what is legal and starts asking what will trigger a response. That's not diplomacy. That's a live wire. And once a system runs on deterrence by warning, every additional action tightens the loop, which brings us to the quiet change that made this possible. The one almost no one noticed while it was happening. For a long time, the system ran on delay. Violence happened, then statements, then investigations, then time. That delay was the buffer. It absorbed shock. It prevented chain reactions. That buffer is gone. What changed wasn't a single decision. It was normalization. Internal repression stopped being treated as an internal matter. Not officially, operationally, a line moved quietly. Before, state violence produced reports. Now it produces thresholds. Before, deaths accumulated into history. Now they accumulate toward response. You can see it in the numbers that escape blackout, in the age of the dead, in the admission that security forces are also dying. That symmetry is new. And it's dangerous, because once casualties appear on both sides, the system stops asking who is right and starts asking who loses control first. Slow change is the most destabilizing kind. It doesn't announce itself. It trains everyone to adapt until adaptation becomes momentum. And momentum doesn't need permission. What looks like unrest is already something else. What sounds contained is already leaking, and the first visible shock was never meant to be the story. The shock people point to is the body count. That's understandable. It's also incomplete. At least 65 people killed, 7 of them children. That number moves through the system like a signal flare. But here's the part that changes everything. 40 members of the security forces are dead too. That is not crowd control. That is not containment. That is a system losing its monopoly on force. When a state starts absorbing casualties at that ratio, the question stops being whether protests will end and becomes whether enforcement still works. The response from the top is immediate and absolute. No leniency, no distinction, no retreat. Judges become extensions of the street. Courts become warnings. Survival becomes policy. At the same time, the outside world is watching in near real time, despite efforts to shut the view down. This is where people usually stop and argue about morality. That's not what matters here. What matters is that a threshold was crossed, and the system noticed. If you think this ends with statements and condemnations, pause before you look away. Because the violence you can count is not the most destabilizing part of this moment. Here's the part most systems try to keep invisible. Repression doesn't fail because it's immoral. It fails because it's expensive. Every hour of force costs money. Every unit deployed needs pay. Every shutdown drains revenue. This regime does not have depth. It runs close to the edge. Paycheck to paycheck. That's why information control matters so much. Cut the internet, and you cut coordination. Cut the images, and you delay reaction. Delay is oxygen. But the blackout didn't seal. Signals leaked. Numbers leaked. Video leaked. And once that happened, the system flipped. Now, every additional act of violence isn't just suppression. It's a financial decision, a reputational decision, a trigger calculation. At the same time, the real vulnerability isn't in the streets. It's in the flow of money. Oil workers stop. Cash stops. Security loyalty erodes. That's the mechanism underneath the chaos. Not ideology. Liquidity. Force buys time. Money buys force. And when that loop breaks, everything accelerates, which is why the next shock doesn't arrive slowly. It arrives all at once. Now the pace changes. Shorter windows, fewer options, less control. Security forces are stretched. Judicial threats escalate. Information still leaks. Every move now has a clock on it. Crack down harder. Risk triggering outside force. Pull back. Risk losing internal control. Shut down the economy. Starve the system that pays the enforcers. This is what acceleration looks like. Not chaos. Compression. Decisions that once took months are now made in hours. Warnings become policies. Policies become tripwires. And everyone knows the rule. If mass violence crosses the line, response follows. Not later. Not diplomatically. Directly. This is why restraint becomes dangerous and escalation becomes tempting. Because when a system believes collapse is possible, it starts choosing speed over stability. That's when mistakes stop being correctable. This moment feels loud, but the loud part is just friction. The real danger is how quickly this can jump from internal failure to external force. And once that jump happens, there is no rewind. This is where you come in, not as a spectator, as a variable. Because systems like this don't collapse in abstractions. They collapse into daily life. You feel it when energy prices jump without explanation, when markets flinch on rumors instead of facts, when leaders start speaking in warnings instead of plans. You're told this is far away, that it's contained, that it doesn't touch you. That's how these systems protect themselves. But when internal violence becomes an international trigger, distance stops working the way it used to. Your economy is tied to theirs. Your security is priced into their instability. Your future absorbs the cost before you're warned. This isn't about empathy. It's about exposure. Because once force becomes conditional on behavior, every similar system starts watching, learning, adapting, and you don't get a vote in that adaptation. Stay with me. Not because this is dramatic, but because understanding the mechanism is the only way to recognize it. When it appears somewhere closer, and it will. What happens next doesn't stay local. Systems like this broadcast, other governments are watching how thresholds are enforced, how warnings are honored, how quickly pressure turns kinetic. Not because they care about this case, but because they're running their own equations. If internal violence now invites external force, then sovereignty has a new price tag. Energy markets don't wait for clarity. They move on fear. Shipping routes reroute on rumors. Alliances harden before outcomes are known. This is how a domestic crisis becomes a global variable. You can see it in how quickly capitals react, in how statements synchronize, in how silence suddenly matters as much as speech. The system is no longer asking, will this stay contained? It's asking, what precedent is being set? Because once one regime learns that repression triggers retaliation, others will either restrain faster or suppress harder, sooner, and darker. Neither outcome is stabilizing. This isn't contagion by ideology. It's contagion by rule change. And the problem with rule changes is that they don't respect borders. They propagate, which leaves us with the future, not as a prediction, but as a set of narrowing paths. From here, the system only has 3 directions it can move. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment. Violence tapers. Signals are recalibrated. The line is approached, then carefully avoided. The system survives by learning the edge of the trigger and living just short of it. This looks like stability. It isn't. It's tension management. The second path is erosion. Force continues, but unevenly. Deaths accumulate without a single defining moment. Warnings remain technically unviolated, but practically hollowed out. Credibility thins. The system doesn't snap. It frays. And fraying systems don't collapse loudly. They leak power until something else fills the gap. The third path is rupture. One event, one order carried too far, one threshold crossed publicly and unmistakably. At that point, restraint disappears, not because anyone wants war, but because the system no longer allows retreat without losing authority. What matters is this. All 3 paths are already active. At the same time, in different hands, the future isn't chosen. It's triggered, and the conditions for that trigger are not theoretical anymore. There is a temptation at the end of stories like this to offer reassurance, to say the system will correct, that leaders will pull back. That history bends away from disaster. This system doesn't work that way. It runs on credibility, on thresholds, on the belief that warnings will be honored exactly once. And once a system like this is built, it doesn't disappear when the cameras move on. It waits. The most dangerous part is not what happens next week. It's what happens the next time a government calculates how much force it can use before the world notices. Because now there is a precedent, and precedents don't stay isolated. They travel, they're studied, they're reused. If you're looking for a clean ending, there isn't one. Only a narrowing field of decisions where speed beats deliberation and restraint carries its own risks. This isn't about predicting collapse or war. It's about recognizing a rule change before it becomes invisible. Stay with this, because the next case won't announce itself as historic. It will look familiar, manageable, almost routine, and that's when systems like this do the most damage. If you want to understand where this goes next, you'll need to follow what happens when credibility is tested again.